Hosidius, Shazian, Lovakenge, Piscarilius, Archaeus. The 5 houses of Great Kurend were finally at peace. After decades of war, King Radha I struck a deal, giving each of the houses a fair share of land and wealth. The great kingdom of Kurend would prosper for many years, but that all changed when the Wintertod invaded the land. The people of Kurend were scared and turned to the king Hosidius V. What are we going to do? King Hosidius didn't have an answer for the fearful citizens, as he did not know much of combat, living in these peaceful times, focused on the crops. Lord Rickard Shazian looked at the king, seeing him struggle with the question, stood up and said, House Shazian will protect us. We have long been training an elite regiment of elder warriors, twisted archers and Kodai mages. We will hold back the approaching doom of winter. The people cheered, and not too long thereafter, the Wintertod was defeated, locking him in his prison. During the following 2 years, the people praised Lord Shazian for his great victory. They also took notice of his continuing progress in the experimentation on the foul creatures called lizardmen. This race was native to Mount Quidamortem, but Lord Shazian would soon find a way to create armies of lizardmen for his own. The people had no suspicions for Shazian's evil plans, and when King Hosidius died of old age, the citizens elected him to be the king. The time of King Shazian VII had started. Months passed, and the new king, with all his newfound power, had finally figured it out. In secret, in the dead of night, he abducted citizens from their beds and had them brought to the Dark Altar, where he would conduct his crazy experiments. His obsession with the powers of the Dark Altar made his plans come to fruition. He had finally learned how to create an army of seemingly infinite amounts of lizardmen. And with this army, he would terrorize the people. He became completely corrupt with power, and all the citizens would be forced to do his bidding, sometimes just entertaining the king with their death. But there were some who resisted. The army of elder warriors, twisted archers and Kodai mages, who the king himself had created and trained, planned a coup to overthrow the corrupt king. They ambushed Rickard, killing all his protectors, and amidst the blood-soaked battlefield, they plunged a knife into his heart, ending his life. And out of nowhere, in this confused, chaotic land, the dark mage Xeric suddenly appeared. Nobody knew who he was, but they saw him here and there, roaming the lands. Tales started spreading of his resemblance to the late King Shazian. It was rumored that the body of the dead king was preserved by the lizardmen he created and was gifted to Xeric in hopes for resurrection. But Xeric claimed the body for himself, transferring his soul through the power of the Dark Altar into the body of King Shazian. But that should have been the least of the people's worries. Xeric befriended the ancient Tassakal creatures, who granted him the gift of immortality long before the ascent of Archaeus. The Tassakal clearly did not realize what kind of monster he would become. He struck his first blow. In one swoop, he killed all the house leaders and claimed powers of this divided kingdom. He had also discovered King Shazian's method of creating lizardmen who would do his bidding and forcing his will. They swept the cities and farms, kidnapping people to serve as slaves or just meat for his experiments. He had invited 3 old friends to Kurend to lead the lizardmen forces, 3 legendary commanders, the Vanguards. For years, the kingdom was in turmoil. Most of the people fled to beyond the Kebos lowlands and founded the Kingdom of Varlamir, where they remained hidden for over 100 years. In this time, Xeric was accumulating more and more knowledge and power. He befriended the High Priest from House Archaeus, Vazanisterio, who would aid him in his experiments. He even learned great methods of teleportation from his closest friend Xamphur, allowing him to teleport anywhere in Kurend. Xeric's hold on the kingdom was strong, not even considering the idea of an uprising, but that would soon change. A farmer witnessed another mindless murder. One of the lizard men had brutally slaughtered a child. The farmer, brave but not gifted in the art of combat, took up his sword against the lizard man. The whole town witnessed it when the farmer drove his sword through the lizard man's torso, avenging the dead child. The farmer sat kneeled down next to the mutilated body, weeping, and looked around. He saw that the whole village had gathered, in awe of his courage. He stood up, urging the people to fight back, and so they did. For 7 days, they drove back the lizardmen forces from Kurend into the Kebos lowlands. Xeric was clearly not expecting such a large uprising. Even his generals, the great vanguards, failed to stop the riots and ran off to save their own lives, which Xeric would not take lightly. The people destroyed the Dark Altar, knowing that was ultimately what gave strength to Xeric. But even though the Dark Altar was destroyed, some of its power continued to emit. Xeric was merely weakened, forcing him into exile, but his spirit endured. He sent out his master architect Tekton to the far west of Mount Quidamortem to create a magical altar in advance of his arrival. The altar would function as a replacement for the Dark Altar, continuing to keep Xeric alive. When the construction of the altar was complete, Xeric, accompanied by his high priest Vazanisterio and many other followers, traveled to the faraway land. Tekton had outdone himself, and in addition, he also started to build a massive underground cave network for Xeric to roam and explore. What Tekton did not anticipate, however, was that the power coming from this altar he built imbued the caves with a magical force. Large crystals started to form, which some of the rulers learned to control. Tekton was the first to harness this power and tried to teach this to Xeric, but he was too weak. Xeric, jealous of the other rulers and priests, ordered the altar to be destroyed. But Tekton was too proud of his work. He would not destroy this altar and secretly merely disabled it. To thank Tekton, Xeric took him underground and shaped him into a new, divine form, with the strength of a god, and created for him an unmatched anvil, granting him the ability to repair his new body whenever it would weaken. In these caves, Xeric continued his experiments, and hired a hound keeper to bring in some wild dogs. Xeric fancied the idea of having a monstrous pet by his side, and after the death of many dogs, he eventually succeeded in transmuting one of the dogs and turned him into a giant, mutated crocodile. Unknowingly, the dog he had transformed was pregnant, who gave birth to a smaller baby mutadile. To feed his new pets forever, he combined the flesh of the dead dogs who failed to survive his experiments with a tree, creating an ever-regenerating meat tree. With all this work in progress and Xeric being back on the rise, the vanguards, who failed and disappointed Xeric during the riots, came back to pledge their allegiance. Xeric treated them with respect, but this was just a ruse. He sent them into the caves, giving them a tour. But once inside, he ordered his other followers to harness the crystal powers of the caves, to twist their hands and buckle their legs. He filled their bodies with lava, boiling their blood. He tortured their bodies and reshaped them into the forms we now know, keeping them as eternal and soulless reminders to never disobey Xeric, guards of the Chambers. Xeric eventually stumbled upon a chamber which held a massive rip of time and space. Curious and power-hungry as he was, Xeric used his magic to fully open the portal to this other dimension, in hopes of acquiring more knowledge and larger forces. Once opened, he stared into the abyss, and quickly, a freakishly large demon wasp flew through the portal. He tried closing the portal, but it was too late. The wasp Vespula claimed the room as his own. Xeric tried taming the creature, but failed, and was driven out by Vespula. The research continued, avoiding the room housing Vespula. Especially the high priest, Vazanisterio, was always studying the crystal and their magical properties, in the hopes of pleasing Xeric. But one evening, while Vaza was in the caves, an earthquake struck. Crystals came loose, falling from the ceiling, burying Vaza. For any ordinary man, this would have meant sudden death. But Vaza was highly trained in the art of magic and had turned his body into an incorporeal form a long time ago. He bound the covering crystals to his spirit, able to move them as an extra limb. This gave him unspeakable power and made him very confident. Too confident, perhaps. After years of serving Lord Xeric, who now didn't even know how to use the crystal magic, he tried to defy him. But Vaza was, even in this new form, no match for Xeric. Xeric struck him down and bound his now corporeal body to 4 giant crystal structures, where he will be forced to remain until they fade to dust. Xeric, with some of the remaining followers, continued to dig further into the caves, and they stumbled on a remarkable creature, the guardian of the deep, the Great Olm. The creature attacked them, striking ferociously with a mass of different magical attacks, and after hours of combat, the Great Olm was finally defeated. Xeric never managed to fully kill it, and he was convinced that no other adventurer would be able to ever slay this beast. Xeric had thought of leaving this land for a while now, so he and the others decided to leave some of their equipment in the caves, using their powers to seal some of their weapons and other armor pieces into crystals, and left the caves for good. He had learned all he could from this cave and disappeared. Nobody knows where he went, but it's speculated that he went searching for more powerful creatures, fulfilling larger ambitions, and potentially planning a new assault on the kingdom of Great Kurend. But since then, for the next 100 years, Xeric was never seen again. Some say that he wandered too far, losing the power the Dark Altar granted him, and perished. But I believe he's still out there, waiting to strike.